The old key slid into the lock with a gentle click. Thomas Grail took a slow breath, the kind that says, "I'm finally home." The house wasn't grand. Just a modest one-story tucked at the edge of Oak Ridge Lane, where the trees whispered secrets in the wind and mailboxes stood like quiet sentinels. The yard was neat, the brick faded by time, and the shutters still carried a bit of charm even through their tired paint. Thomas paused at the doorstep, cane in hand, and let his eyes roam the street. It was clean, predictable, peaceful, exactly what he was looking for. He stepped inside, dropped his leather satchel near the coat stand, and exhaled the kind of sigh that comes only after decades of noise. Courtrooms, flashbulbs, headlines. Here, there would be none of that. No final gavel slams. No high-stakes arguments. Just mornings with tea and maybe, eventually, peace. He thought he had finally left conflict behind. But Oak Ridge had its own kind of courtroom and its own kind of jury. It took just 3 days. Thomas was in the backyard, pruning an overgrown lilac bush, when the doorbell rang. The sound felt too cheery, like a jingle from a department store. He opened the front door to find a woman beaming at him, clipboard in hand, lips stretched into the kind of smile that held more calculation than kindness. "Good morning," she sang. "I'm Carol Prentice, president of the Oak Ridge Lane HOA. You must be Mr. Grail." He nodded once. "Just Thomas is fine." She extended her hand. "We like to keep things tidy and organized here. Everyone does their part." Thomas took her hand briefly, polite, not warm. "Well, we just need your signature," she said, tapping the clipboard with a glossy red nail. "It's a simple thing, really, just to make it official." Thomas looked down at the paper. It was thick with fine print. A lot of rules. More signatures. "I'm not joining," he said quietly. Carol blinked. "Sorry. I'm not interested in the HOA." She let out a breathy chuckle. "Oh, it's kind of expected, you know? Everyone here joins. It's just how we keep things in harmony." Thomas smiled faintly. "Harmony doesn't require paperwork." There was a beat of silence. Her smile didn't falter, but something behind her eyes did. "Well," she said tightly, "we'll talk again soon. I'm sure you'll come around." Thomas nodded. "Have a good day." He closed the door. And just like that, the opening argument had been made. That night, Thomas found a note in his mailbox. No envelope, just folded paper, slightly crumpled from the wind. Oak Ridge isn't kind of people who think they're above the rules. There was no name, no return address. He reread it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. He wasn't rattled. Not yet. But something in the air had changed, subtle, like the shift before a storm. The next morning, his trash wasn't collected. Just his. The cans were untouched while the neighbor's bin sat empty and clean. Later, a dog tore through his garden bed. A neighbor's car blocked his driveway for an entire afternoon. And twice that week, someone rang his doorbell in the middle of the night, then vanished. It wasn't criminal. Not quite. But it was clear he wasn't welcome. Still, he said nothing. Not to the police. Not to the neighbors. Not to the HOA. Instead, he wrote dates, took photos, recorded details. Not out of paranoia, but practice. Because Thomas knew something the HOA didn't. The ones who build walls of petty power often forget they're made of paper. It started slow. A citation for an untrimmed lawn edge, despite the crisp ruler-straight grass line. Then another, unapproved light fixtures. The porch lights that came with the house. And another, mailbox design not conforming to HOA standards. Each notice was taped to his door, like a child's tantrum scribbled in legalese. Each more absurd than the last. Thomas said nothing, just added them to a folder, plastic, blue, and growing thicker by the week. Carol passed his house often now, not walking, inspecting, watching him behind those designer sunglasses. Once, she paused on the sidewalk as he swept the porch. "Still resisting?" she said, as if talking about a flu shot. He smiled at her gently. "Still breathing?" She frowned, the way people do when they can't figure out if you're joking or threatening. "You're not making it easy on yourself." Thomas stopped sweeping. That's never been my goal. While Carol waged her silent war, the rest of Oak Ridge began to stir. At first, neighbors watched from windows. Then they started whispering. Did you hear what they're doing to Mr. Grail? I thought he was just a retired teacher. No, my cousin said he was a judge. A real one. State level or something. The neighborhood had grown used to compliance, used to bending. But Thomas? He didn't bend. And in some strange way, that unsettled people and intrigued them. One Saturday, a boy from across the street, maybe 14, wandered over while Thomas was pruning the bushes again. Hey, Mr. Grail, he said, shy but curious. Are you really a judge? Thomas looked up, squinting slightly in the sun. Was. Long time ago. The boy scratched his head. So, why don't you just shut them down? I mean, you probably could, right? Thomas wiped his brow with a handkerchief, then smiled. Because strength isn't about making noise. It's about knowing when to use it. The boy didn't fully understand, but one day he would. The night was quiet. That thick kind of quiet that presses on your chest, where even the crickets seem hesitant. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug. Chamomile, his nightly routine. The only routine he truly cared about these days. Until something fell off. It wasn't a sound that caught his attention. It was the absence of one. That stillness, like the world was holding its breath. He rose slowly, came clicking softly on the floor, and moved toward the front of the house. By the time he opened the door, the scent had reached him. Burnt. Faint, yes, but unmistakable. His heart didn't race. That part of him had long been trained out. Years on the bench had taught him to react like a stone in water. Slow, clear, deliberate. But still, something sank in his gut. He stepped outside and saw it. The roses, the ones he spent the last 2 weeks tending, blackened now, the soil around them scorched. The charred outline of a small bottle, melted plastic, lay half buried in the dirt. His hose lay nearby, slashed clean across the center. For a long time he just stood there. The cold air bit at his arms, but he didn't flinch, because this wasn't vandalism. This was a warning. And Thomas Grail had spent a lifetime reading warnings and handing down sentences. He bent slightly, picked up a petal that hadn't quite burned, and whispered to it like a prayer. They're getting desperate. The next morning came with warm sun and cold silence. Neighbors shuffled through their routines. Lawn sprinklers whispered crossgrass. Garage doors hummed open. Children chased each other with backpacks dangling from their shoulders. And Thomas walked. Calm, steady. He passed the smoldered bushes, now reduced to ash in memory, and crossed the street to Carol's house. She was out front watering her chrysanthemums, eyes hidden behind large sunglasses, fingers tapping nervously at her phone. She looked up, saw him, and smiled that polished, practiced smile. Mr. Grail, she said, voice lilting like she was hosting a tea party. Ms. Prentice, I heard about the little mishap in your yard. So terrible. Kids, probably. Maybe, he said. Long pause. Carol fidgeted with her watering can, not meeting his eyes. Strange how things escalate, isn't it? Thomas said softly. Carol blinked. I beg your pardon? I mean a garden today. Who knows what burns tomorrow? For a heartbeat, the air between them turned to glass. Thin, sharp, ready to shatter. Then Carol laughed. I do hope it doesn't happen again. Thomas leaned in slightly, voice quiet enough that only she could hear. It won't. I promise. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing stiffly among her flowers. The smile never returned. The fire came like a thief. Thomas was asleep when it began, but dreams, oddly, had warned him. He woke with a start. Smoke clung to the ceiling like ghosts. His lungs knew before his brain did. He threw off the blanket, coughing hard. His cane scraped the floor as he moved toward the door. Heat pushed against the walls like something alive. When he opened the front door, the air hit him, hot and furious. His porch was aflame. The fire hadn't crept. It had rushed. Accelerant. Intent. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was a sentence. Neighbors spilled into the street. Some shouting, some filming. But Thomas didn't look at them. He stood there, just past the flames, eyes glazed with quiet grief and resolve. A firefighter pulled up minutes later, radio crackling. "Sir, are you all right?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I will be. We're going to need to know how it started. If you saw anything." He didn't break eye contact with the blaze. "I didn't see them, but I saw their intent." "What's that supposed to mean?" Thomas looked at the firefighter for the first time. There was no fear in his eyes. "It means they tried to scare the wrong man." The next few days passed like smoke, quiet, hovering over everything. Thomas didn't rebuild. Not yet. He relocated to a small guest room at the back of the church, slept on a cot, ate simple food, and began to gather paperwork, evidence, witness statements, but more importantly, silence. Silence from the neighbors who didn't quite know what to say, from the HOA, who suddenly stopped sending letters, from Carol, who hadn't been seen in 3 days. Thomas sat beneath the chapel's stained glass window, light washing across his notebook, as he filled line after line with observations, times, events, reactions. It wasn't just a report, it was a story. And stories he knew how to end. One evening, a young mother from the block, Eliza, approached him in the church hallway. "I just wanted to say," she began, voice trembling, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Thomas closed his notebook. "You're speaking now. That matters." She hesitated. "She's done this to others, too. Fines, threats, letters that made no sense. My husband wanted to move." "Why didn't you?" She looked him in the eyes. "Because when you stayed after the fire, we realized we could, too." Thomas didn't smile. He nodded. "Because strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just present. Just a simple white paper with thick black text. Tired being afraid? Come talk." It spread like wildfire, pinned to bulletin boards, slipped under doors, tucked into mailboxes. And when the day came, the small church hall filled fast. 57 people. More than Thomas expected. He didn't stand behind a podium. He stood among them. "Some of you know me as the man with the burned house," he began. "Others may have seen me as just a neighbor who wouldn't sign a form." Soft chuckles. "But I'm not here to settle scores. I'm here to ask a question. Who are we when no one is watching?" Silence. He lifted a folder. This contained statements, photos, letters, actions taken by people you trusted to represent you. "I'll be bringing it to court next week." Gasps. Murmurs. He raised his hand. "This isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming our street, our dignity." Someone in the back stood up, Eliza's husband. "I'll testify." Then another voice. And another. "I've got emails I can share. I kept the notices she sent me. I was on the board. I'm done lying." The room swelled not with chaos, but courage. For the first time, Oak Ridge Lane stood as one. And in the corner, Thomas watched. Quiet, still, the way a judge watches when the jury finally sees the truth. Carol Prentice had always moved like someone who belonged at the head of the table. Her voice, polished, assertive, had the power to silence rooms. Her emails were crisp, curt, bullet-pointed like they'd been carved from stone. But now her hands shook. It started small. Forgotten words. A garden committee meeting, canceled with no explanation. She didn't walk her dog as often. She flinched at doorbells. And then came her letter. A folded white sheet, anonymous in appearance, but unmistakably hers. Thomas found it resting on his doorstep one morning. The edges curled from dew. "We regret the recent events. Mr. Grail's claims are unfortunate misunderstandings. The HOA remained committed to unity. No name signed, just the board." Thomas sat on his porch swing, holding the letter like it might dissolve. He didn't feel anger. He felt pity. A woman so used to control, now clinging to it like a drowning sailor clutching driftwood. Later that day, a knock at the chapel door interrupted his quiet. It was Greg, balding, shy, always soft-spoken. But this time, his hands were firm, holding out a phone like it carried something sacred. "There's something you need to hear," he said, his voice dry. It played. Static, then words. Carol's voice, unmistakable. You vote against Grail, or the next letter's yours. I don't care if he's a judge. He needs to be shut up. Thomas closed his eyes. Not because he was shocked, but because part of him still wanted to believe she wouldn't go that far. Courtroom smelled like coffee and nerves. Thomas walked in slowly. The click of his cane echoed like punctuation in a quiet book. He wasn't wearing robes this time, just a dark suit pressed humble. Carol sat across the aisle. For the first time, she looked small, not physically, but spiritually, her posture stiff, her hair too neat, her eyes flickering too fast. When the judge recognized Thomas, she smiled kindly. Didn't expect to see you here again, Grail. I thought I was done, too, he replied. But sometimes justice calls twice. Testimonies began. Greg was first. He trembled at first, then steadied. Eliza followed. Her voice cracked when she described the late-night fear, the threats hidden in polite language. Then a man named Victor, formerly silent, stood. I was on the HOA board. Carol made me believe we were protecting the neighborhood, but I was protecting her ego. Gasps, whispered reactions. The courtroom began to feel less like a legal space and more like a collective confession. Then Thomas stood. No notes, no theatrics. You know what makes a neighborhood? It's not paint colors or lawn length. It's dignity, compassion, people who feel safe looking their neighbors in the eye. This wasn't dispute. This was fear. Fear weaponized by someone who forgot that leadership means service, not power. And I'll stand here alone if I must, but I won't stay silent while someone tries to burn that principle to ground. Not one I blinked. Not one heart beat quietly. The silence after his words was the loudest sound in the room. The verdict arrived on a cloudy Tuesday. The judge's voice was calm, almost gentle. The court finds in favor of Mr. Grail. A beat of silence, not celebration, but release. Carol stared at the floor. Her lawyer gathered the papers without a word. The room didn't erupt. It exhaled. Thomas didn't smile. Not because he wasn't pleased, but because he knew the story wasn't about a courtroom win. It was about a cultural one. Carol moved out 2 weeks later. No goodbye. No garage sale. Just a moving van in the dawn light, and a single rear-view glance as she turned the corner. Thomas stood in his slippers on the porch, holding a warm mug. No gloating, just quiet. It was over. Or, at least, the storm was. The rebuilding was just beginning. Oak Ridge Lane was still Oak Ridge Lane, but different, slower, lighter. Kids' chalk art began appearing on sidewalks. Someone installed a little free library at the corner. Greg and his wife planted sunflowers along the path. Even the silence between neighbors began to thaw. One afternoon, Eliza walked over with a plate of muffins and a bold idea. A book club. Justice and coffee. She called it. We read courtroom stories. You judge the endings. Thomas laughed. Truly laughed. For the first time in months. He said no. She showed up again the next week. This time, she brought a handwritten note. You don't have to judge to teach. So he came. He didn't say much. Just listened. Watched people rediscover themselves through stories. He saw fear drain from their posture. Heard laughter return to voices that had once trembled. It was no longer his street. It was theirs. Seasons passed. The roses, once burned, once buried, had returned. Not in Thomas's yard. In Eliza's. He'd gifted her the clippings. Justice, he said when she asked the name. One fall morning, he walked as usual, coat zipped, cane in hand. At the corner, a teenager jogged past, then doubled back. You're the judge, right? Thomas smiled. I was. The boy paused, unsure. My mom said what you did helped her feel like we mattered again. Thomas looked at him, then placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. You always did. You just forgot for a while. He walked on. Back home, the breeze rustled leaves across the sidewalk, soft whispering. And in the rhythm of it, Thomas heard something. Not applause, not celebration. Peace. Because in the end, the lesson wasn't about punishment. It was about standing and showing others how to stand with you.